Blog Talk Radio.
Carol the Coach. Sex, love, and relationships. We talk about it here.
Carol the Coach. Compassion with contemporary relevance.
I am a psychotherapist. I can be your personal life coach, and I can help you with your issues. There are no problems too small or too big. You can talk about anything.
Speaker, columnist, radio TV host, and commentator. Carol the Coach brings messages of wellness and empowerment within reach of everyday people every day.
Almost 5 years ago, I lost my soulmate in an accident. He was killed in a plane crash. Life just, for me, has seemed to stop.
There are groups all over the city. I teach one. It is a specific way to start thinking so that you shift how you see the world, which then shifts your energy, and then you feel better and you actually see things differently.
Carol the Coach. Always available too at carolthecoach.com.
Now I've got Russell on the line.
I'm 47 years old. I'm a truck driver. I am married. I have a wife in San Francisco.
Okay.
I haven't been home in 6 months. My thing is, I don't know if I have a sex addiction or what the problem is. Why do I want what I can't have? And as soon as I can have it, I don't want it anymore.
You're right on target when you say, I don't know if I have a sexual addiction. Well, guess what? Yes, you do. And you know what? That's my specialty, Russell, so you're at the right place. Continue.
I meet women online, and I'm in a different part of the country. I travel all 48 states, so I love sex.
I hear self-esteem issues. You never felt good enough, and you didn't feel like you were getting what you should have then, and you're reenacting that now. Do you want to change that about yourself? You get what you need.
Hey there. Hi, I'm Carol Jurgensen Sheets. Welcome to the Sex Help with Carol the Coach show, the only show on the internet that exclusively deals with sexual addiction and partner trauma. And I got a lot of exciting things happening. You're going to hear about it probably for the next 20 shows. So excuse me if you heard about it last week, but I got to tell you, if you're listening to this show and you have been following us for about 4 years, you know that I have done my best to bring to you the experts in the field of sexual addiction, and just published through ebookit.com a book called Sexual Addiction, Wisdom from the Masters, and it is 12 transcripts from my show that I have edited to make it more reader-friendly. And, the people that I have interviewed are amazing. They're the greats, and they talk about different topics, intimacy, emotional intimacy, and attachment. Why do some people with sexual addiction not have the attachment they needed as a kid that helped to contribute to their sexual addiction today? Defense mechanisms. Yours truly had that chapter. It was on what defense mechanisms do sex addicts use to sustain their sexual addiction. If you work on those defense mechanisms, going to be a better spouse, a better person, and in better recovery. We have Patrick Carnes, the guru of sexual addiction, talking about how the suffering you're dealing with right now actually promotes excellent sexual recovery. And that is so important because I know if you're listening to this show, you want recovery or you are in recovery. And I want to welcome you with open arms to this show. Now, for our partners, we have Barbara Steffens, who started the Institute for Partner Trauma Professionals. We are experts at treating trauma, and we're experts at treating partners. This is not just somebody who wants to know how to get her husband or his wife not to cheat. We know that you, as a partner, have been through stress that nobody else has ever been through, anxiety nobody else has ever been through, that hasn't actually dealt with chronic infidelity, a husband or wife that looks at excessive pornography, a husband or wife that participates in exhibitionism, voyeurism, frauderism. And when you've been betrayed like that, it's very, very difficult to get back on track and develop trust and to control your emotions. And so Barbara was instrumental in getting a professional group together and certified to treat partner trauma. I am 3 hours away. This week that I complete my certification. I've been trained, but we had to get so many hours of certification to assure our supervisors that we know what the heck we're doing. And I'm so excited to be able to provide that. So you have Barbara Steffens. You have, has anybody read the book A House Interrupted? Because I'm telling you, that book is an incredible narrative on partner trauma. A woman who dealt with a man that she thought was absolutely normal and found out that he had betrayed her their entire marriage. So this book is wonderful, and I'm only singing its praises because what's even more wonderful is the fact that every cent that actually comes from being purchased goes to AFAR, the American Federation for Addiction Research. You know, sexual addiction was not recognized yet in the psychiatric manual, and we are working on research to substantiate that it is indeed a condition of compulsivity. Now, I got to be honest with you. The researchers that have worked on sexual addiction say there is more research out there than for other illnesses, other disorders. And part of the issue is that it's a very controversial topic, sexual addiction. It is so controversial that I went to an addiction hospital here in Indianapolis, and I said, please let me train your staff. Because what we know is when somebody stops using drugs and alcohol, their sexual addiction gets worse. If they have sexual addiction, it almost invariably will get worse. It's kind of like playing the whack-a-mole game. You really get this addiction under control, and another addiction rears its ugly head. And the hospital said, Carol, we'd love to have you do that. However, we would lose our funding. Yep, sexual addiction is still kind of hush-hush, and it's swept under the rug, and that's why we need more and more and more research to get it into the psychiatric manual so we can start getting hospitals that offer treatment that is reimbursed by insurance companies so people aren't having to pay out of pocket, and intensive outpatient programs that are also reimbursable, and actually even outpatient therapy. You know, one of the things that I know about treating somebody with sexual addiction is that they may have anxiety, they may have depression, they may have obsessive-compulsive tendencies. So more often than not, I can dual diagnose and use one of those diagnoses that they indeed do have to get reimbursement. But if it were just on sexual addiction, I would not have that reimbursement. And so we've got a long way to go in terms of seeking health insurance reimbursement for these kinds of psychiatric disorders. Now I'm going to tell you how you can get this book. You can go to Amazon. You can go to Barnes & Nobles. It is an e-book. So you got to have a Kindle, an iPhone, an Android. You know the drill. Or you can go to my website, Sex Help with Carol the Coach. And on the first page, at the very bottom, you can scroll down, and it will say, Get Carol's eBooks. Now, one of the eBooks is for clinicians who want to run groups for sex addicts. The other ebook is Sexual Addiction, Wisdom from the Masters. And I promise you, if you don't like it, I'll reimburse you. because this has been a labor of love for me. I have really wanted to help AFAR raise the money. And I told them I could raise $50,000, so I'm asking all of you, please, please, please. The book is only $9.95. I promise you there's good stuff in there. Good stuff for the addict, good stuff for the partner, good stuff for family. And, we don't just treat people in a vacuum. We want to help everybody. Hey, and I think that's why I'm actually interviewing Dr. Jennifer Weeks tonight. She recently released her new book, Sex Education, How to Talk to Your Teen About Cybersex and Pornography in the Digital Age. And so I wanted her to come on the show and help educate us as to how do you talk to teens about pornography, how do you talk to teens about cybersex, sexting and texting, and how do you have a good open relationship with your child and still help them to navigate through this crazy, crazy world. By the time a child is 11, if he's male, he will have at least seen over 20 hours of pornography. How could that be? Well, he may see it at home because mom or dad left the computer with history, and kids are always curious. Or, these kids are sending each other bizarre pornography that they can't believe. So they send it to all their buddies and all their girlfriends, and it gets distributed school-wide. I probably have told you that when I first got into this business, I got into it because I was getting calls from school administrators, specifically superintendents and principals, that did not know what to do with sexual behavior that was out of control. Kids were having oral sex on the bus. Kids were taking pictures of kids having oral sex, and then they were distributing it to their friends. And so, it wasn't just the people that engaged in sexual activity that was inappropriate in a public place, but it was also all the kids that witnessed it as well as the kids that received the videos, the images. And you can imagine schools did not even know what to do with this. And as a result, they came to me because I was a sex educator. I am not certified, but I was a sex educator in the biggest hospital system in Indianapolis. And I said to myself, well, I do believe I know what to do basically, but I need more training. And that's when I went to ITAP, the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, and I got my certification. I became a CSAT, a Certified Sexual Addictions Therapist. And from there, I learned what to do with folks, be it male, female, be it school age, teenagers, college age, and up. Now, I got to tell you, we are all pioneers in the field, and there are plenty of times that I have to consult with other professionals to make sure that I'm on track with my assessment, my diagnosis, and my interventions. However, some of this isn't rocket science. You have to be comfortable talking with kids. Today I had a kid who I am actually working with by having him read Facing the Shadows. And although that book is way above what he is specifically engaged in today, the first couple of chapters talks about the secrets, the problems that your sexual compulsivity has caused, the excuses you use. And those kids use the same excuses, have a lot of the same secrets, and certainly manifest the same problems as anybody any age. And so that's why I'm really excited that Dr. Jennifer Weeks is going to be with us, because she has written a book specifically for parents on how to work with teens who are experiencing cybersex and pornography in the digital age. So, as usual, these are the experts in the field, and I just feel so fortunate to bring them on. So, Dr. Jennifer, how are you tonight?
I'm wonderful, Carol. Thank you. How are you?
I am excellent also, and I was just telling my listening audience that I got into this business because of school-age, middle school, and adolescent teenagers who were exhibiting compulsive sexual behavior. So I'm real excited tonight to be asking you some basic questions as well as some complicated questions whereby you can help kids and their parents navigate through this whole cybersex epidemic. Can you tell me what made you decide to write the book?
Absolutely. I think I come at this the opposite direction of what you just shared, in that I started my work in addiction and with sexual addictions with adults. And that's really what prompted me to write a book, in that I was having all of these men come in and the ages of my clients getting younger and younger. And one of the questions I always ask them is, how did they learn about sex and sexuality? When did they first see pornography? All of those kinds of basic questions about their introduction to the sexual world. And what I found is that most of them, regardless of age, never got any education, had parents who maybe, didn't say anything, said, very minimal things about sex itself, never spoke about more detailed things like pornography or other types of sexuality, and they ended up learning things on their own. And part of my work specializes with offending behaviors as well, sexual offending behaviors as well, and I just kind of had a moment where I was like, where is the prevention work? In the substance abuse field and gambling, you see billboards and you see public service announcements, and people are doing prevention for other addictions, and I never see anybody doing prevention for sexual addiction or pornography addiction. And so this is sort of my, prevention effort, which really comes out of the work I do with my clients in the office.
Well, that makes so much sense. And so that is how you decided to actually kind of spearhead the writing of this book. And again, for our listening audience, if they just tuned in, I am talking with Dr. Jennifer Weeks, who wrote The New Age of Sex Education, How to Talk to Your Teen About Cybersex and Pornography in the Digital Age. And so, if I understand you correctly, what you realized is something that, I have also known, that sex is a topic that typically is not discussed, even in families. Healthy sexuality is typically avoided. So any kids that had questions either looked up information on their own or went to their peers to find out what sex education was all about. And experimentation was the number one way that so many of the kids that I worked with, it indoctrinated them into the world of sexuality, and that can lead to some compulsivity, especially if there's guilt and shame and secrecy behind a lot of this sexual behavior. Is that not correct?
Absolutely. You hit on the two of the words that come up, in my office when I talk about this the most is shame and secrecy. And what I talk about in the book and my philosophy around this is that, internet sexuality is not necessarily all bad, right? If you've got, you don't know where to get answers, you can get really good answers online about sexual education and STDs and prevention. Kids who are struggling with, homosexuality, transgender issues, and don't feel comfortable to have somebody to talk to, they can find good information. The struggle that you and I see in our office is that there's so many kids that get online that aren't, get exposed to not good information. So parents aren't talking about it. What I learned in researching this is that sex education in schools is really not a lot, and a lot of states don't even require schools to teach accurate sex education. So if you're not getting your information from your parents, you're not getting your information from your schools. In today's age, you're getting it online. So if I'm looking something up about sexuality and I end up at pornography, whether that's what I call vanilla, kind of, straight-laced pornography or something very hardcore, that brings up all of these issues, that, this shame, the secrecy that you're talking about. Can I, I saw this online, I don't know how to react to it. Can I talk to my parents? If not, boom, that goes into the secrecy. If I have a reaction to it and I don't know how to, physical reaction to it, and I don't know how to handle that, do I have shame around that? And all of these things, the secrets, the shame, the curiosity, the exposure can get wrapped up. And for some kids, everything works out okay. And, as some kids end up, with some bigger issues, some compulsive issues or some legal issues even sometimes in the end.
Yes, I find that the more unusual sexual activity they see, more brain lock occurs. It's like a curiosity. It's like a train wreck. They certainly say you see an accident on the highway, everybody slows down. But when these kids are seeing things that they weren't meant to see, that are absolutely perplexing, unique, curious, and I'm trying to think of a word that would describe kind of their abhorrence at it. They also, after they turn it off, they think about it and they want to go back to it and investigate it again, and it can create compulsivity.
Absolutely, and I think that's where, we have this confusion. There is biology, right? We have a biological reaction to arousing, visual stimuli, and that's what pornography is. That's its whole purpose. So I think another thing that can create that confusion is that if my body is having a reaction to that and my brain is having this, repulsed, disgusted, reaction as well, you've now got this dissonance as well that we're dealing with. So which pull do I go with? Do I go with the pull of, the biology and that dopamine thing that feels really good? Or, do I go with my rational brain or, my moral values that have been instilled in me? And that sets up that conflict. And, and it is that biology, that dopamine that can get adults and teens, hooked in and can have something that, maybe didn't start out compulsive, end up being a compulsive problem.
Well, and you're talking about dopamine, and obviously dopamine is a brain chemical that's released, and it's released in the reward center. Can you explain to our listening audience what dopamine is from a psychosexual point of view?
Sure, you're going to bring me back to my graduate school days and see how well I do here. Dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters, obviously, that is released in our brain, most frequently associated with the reward center, as you said. So, when we see something or do something, same thing happens with drugs or gambling. What the studies are finding is that a lot of these behaviors, as well as substances, release dopamine in the brain. So it's goes into that reward center. If something is rewarded, the dopamine gets released, and it feels good. That's why we do things. It's a rewarding, pleasurable experience. So what happens, when that can get tangled up, is that dopamine release is something we begin to crave. So, sex and sexuality are pleasurable experiences. It's biologically designed that way, right? If we don't find sex pleasurable, how are we going to reproduce? There goes the species. So it's sort of biologically created to be pleasurable and release dopamine. The internet very frequently can hijack that. You get exposed to so much stimuli, so frequently, so fast, so intense, that it really can kind of hijack that dopamine system. So we begin to crave that dopamine hit and need a higher level of stimuli to get that same dopamine feeling. I often explain it to people, which they find maybe a little more understandable in terms of alcoholism, right? Somebody who's an alcoholic didn't start out drinking 2/5 of vodka a day. They maybe started out having a beer or two. As time went on, they needed more of that substance to get the same feeling. Same thing happens with the pornography, is that we start out looking at something maybe not real hardcore, maybe not something that, is so out of the bell curve. We get desensitized to that, and we need more and more and more. For some people, that more is frequency, duration, so they're looking at it every day, all day, hours, binge. For some people, that increases the type of stimuli they're looking at, so they go from looking at, maybe traditional heterosexual, if they're a heterosexual person, pornography, to other different themes, into kink, maybe into even things like violence, bestiality, to get that dopamine hit. So that dopamine hook is huge, and that's part of what is that cycle of addiction for pornography. I hope that made sense.
Oh, 100%. You did a great job of explaining that. Now, I was going to ask you, why do teens sex or look at online pornography? And certainly you have answered part of that. What's your take on sexting and why that is so compulsive?
Well, I think sexting is something that maybe not all generations understand, and even my generation doesn't understand because we're not what we call digital natives, right? We didn't grow up with a phone in our hand. We called people, we wrote letters. Today's teens grew up with digital technology. They text. That's what they do. That's how they communicate. So for a lot of teens, sexting is actually just an extension of that texting. So it's seen really, from the scientific data as an extension of the courtship ritual. So if I'm, flirting with somebody, maybe that includes, some sexy messages. If I'm in a relationship with someone, it's not out of the norm for that to include sexting, which might include imagery. The whole legal piece is another discussion there. So teens are doing it not as frequently also as the media portrays, but they're doing it just part of that natural courtship piece in traditional, or where it's not problematic. It can become problematic, obviously, just like any other behavior, if we have non-consensual sexting. So, I send a picture to somebody who I think is my boyfriend. We break up. He gets mad. He sends it to all of his friends or things like that. You hear about that in the media. So we can get into issues of consent. And it can also become compulsive in the same way that viewing pornography or other online sexuality can, in that you've got that high stimulation, right? One of the things that makes looking at pornography online different than the old school looking at a magazine is really the rate at which you get data. You get image. Guys will talk about the click, 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 and how it's just so rapid. And if you have someone, you're a teen, you're, messaging with a whole bunch of different people on Snapchat or Kik, you can be getting all of this data input, and that, that again, we're back in that dopamine space. We're in in that rush that it can get really compulsive and something they get hooked on.
Absolutely. And, you said that you do believe that it's somewhat exaggerated, but I really feel like so many teens today are expected to send pictures of themselves in sexy poses and pictures of themselves in lingerie or their workout garb and their nakedness. And when they choose not to, they don't feel like they can measure up to the other girls specifically, although certainly lots of boys send those pictures. I don't think it's about measuring up. I think it's a way to flirt and to activate interest. But they don't feel like they can measure up, and so they're under this incredible pressure, and they have been desensitized to believe that being scantily clothed, showing cleavage, wearing Daisy Dukes, that is part of how you engage with the opposite sex, or same sex, too.
Absolutely. And what I find interesting, I'm going to kind of take that topic and go on a little tangent, but it's related, is what the data shows about how the kids actually view sexting. So most teens, when you look at the research studies, don't view sexting as a really big deal when it's done, and they don't think of the legal issues. What they think about and what they worry about are the social repercussions. And there's some gender differences here, which I think are interesting and kind of relate to what you're talking to, in that, boys, and I'm going to use a heterosexual relationship here because that's what the data, where we have the data. Boys, it's part of this process. I'm flirting with a girl. Can I get her to send me a sexy picture? And if the boy can get a girl to send him the sexy picture, it sort of increases his street cred, so to speak, right? It increases his rep. He can be the guy who gets the girls to send that sexy picture. So there's pressure on the boy to get the girls to do this. On the other end of this gender spectrum, again, so here we have the girls, and the girls are feeling, from the research, really a lot of pressure to do this. So they're not necessarily sending the sexy pictures. because they want to or because, they're really into it, but because they're succumbing to that social pressure of this is what I'm, quote, unquote, supposed to do. So, if you're the guy and you can get the sexy picture, you're the man, you can get the girl. If you're the girl, you send it and somebody finds out, the double standard is there, then you're the easy girl, you're the slut, you're all of those, shaming names that people will call girls who get caught sending these sext images. So the relationship that the kids have to sexting, I think, is really complicated, and we adults tend to look at it sort of really black and white, but it's so involved in their social culture, and there's so much else going on there.
Oh, I would 100% agree, and that's why this topic can feel so overwhelming to parents because, A, parents have not been exposed like we have to how kids view this stuff. They don't get to talk with kids non-judgmentally and find out what's going on, as well as we've done lots of literature reading. We've done lots of research. We have each other as a listserv to talk to about this issue. So if I've got a parent on the line right now, and I'm sure I have many, many parents that are listening, can you share with them direction you would give them in terms of talking to their kids about the digital age? And then we'll talk about apps and what they should talk to their kids about in terms of sexting and everything. But when you're working with a parent, what are some of the common guidelines you give them?
There's a lot, but I think what the first thing we do is to say, okay, be aware, get some education, for the parent, and we help them there, but that also includes talking to your child. So, we get our best information as clinicians who work with younger populations about what's hot from the actual kids, right? You work with kids, you know that. Like, I'm 43, so I'm not as in and hip to everything that's going on as someone who's 15 when it comes to what apps they're using and things. So parents have to get educated. They have to, read the papers or go online and look and say, okay, what are teens doing? And that's kind of what I'd call the academic search. But the other piece of that is to be a little involved in their child's life. Talk to them about what they do, And I often use media examples or things like, I saw, a news article about Snapchat. Are you and your friends using that? Or things just not accusatory, but just what are you doing online? What's on your phone? As conversation and to become involved. And what some of the studies have shown is that, when parents do that engagement, kids actually want to talk to their parents about these things. Hey, this is my life. Let me let you into my digital world a little bit. And that, it obviously increases the communication and the bond between the parent and the child, but it gives parents a little bit of information in terms of what they're doing online. So I think that's sort of the first place we go.
Dr. Jen, you are promising that if a parent approaches their child and does so in a non-judgmental way about, hey, what's going on? Do you ever use Snapchat? I read where that's a great way to have pictures and express yourself. You believe that the kids are going to really share some of their information because they want their parents to know about their life.
But promise is a big word, so you can't promise. But I mean, what the research shows us, and what we've seen in our office, is that they do actually want to talk about these things. Because if you're a digital native and you've got a digital immigrant parent, we seem pretty clueless. Like, we're not cool. We don't know what's going on, and the kid can be sort of that source of information. But what other studies have shown, if you just look at sex education in general, kids want their information from their parents. And there's a piece of that, like there's studies that have been done, regarding general sex education. Where do you get your sex education from? School, the school nurse, the internet. Where do you want it from? I want it from mom and dad. So I do think that actually, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, it's embarrassing. Sometimes they're probably not going to give you all of their information right away, but I think if you start that dialogue and it just becomes routine about curiosity about your child's digital life, they do open up about that.
Well, that makes total sense. And so that has not changed, that kids want to be able to share themselves with their parents, and parents certainly want to know what's going on with kids.
Yes. I think so. I think where there's a lot of struggle. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no. When you said a lot of struggle, continue.
So where I think there's a lot of struggle for parents is to approach that in a non-judgmental, non-accusatory fashion. And to just be curious and not be like, are you sexting? Are you, what are you doing? Because it goes back to what you talked about in the beginning, that element of shame. It would be best to not induce any elements of shame when you're talking about sex and sexuality, because what we know, you and I know in this field, is that when you infuse shame with sex and sexuality, it goes into secret, and that's where you can really run into some compulsive problems down the road.
Absolutely. And so if you're a parent and you don't know anything about the digital age, you mentioned Snapchat, but what other apps are teens using most frequently today? And what do parents need to be aware of?
Sure, and I think that the answer to that question changes day by day, to be honest with you. And you can look at, data and research and things, and there's different types of apps that teens are using. So social media. The trend is that teens are going away from Facebook. They're still using it, but not quite so much. It's not really as cool for a teen to use Facebook when grandma's on it. Moving towards things like Snapchat, Instagram, Kik for messaging. They're using YouTube all the time for a lot of information gathering. I'm going to try to, there's webcam apps, but I think, if you look at just sort of social media, yes, Facebook, but not as much. Instagram, which is all images. Snapchat, which we hear about in the news a lot. Obviously, that's the app where, I'll say allegedly, your message goes away after 24 hours. We've heard media reports of these things being hacked. You can always kind of screenshot things. Are big ones and ones where you hear in the news about sexting issues with these types. I've got a lot of kids using Kik to message, and adults, which is just another messenger app. Those I think are the big ones. Then there's always, I think, moving into some of maybe the problematic behaviors. There's webs or apps that that are used a lot for bullying. There's webcam or interactive chat roulette, Omegle, or some apps and web devices where we see kids doing some video chat. Periscope, any of the live type things as well. Like Facebook has launched Live, and now they just launched sort of a competition for Snapchat, things that go away in 24 hours. So to answer that question is hard, and I feel like I'm kind of stumbling over my words because it just changes. Something becomes popular, and then 2 months later something else comes out, and that becomes popular, which I think is why it's hard for everybody to keep up, and why I think we as clinicians and as the parents have to we have to be aware and be educating ourselves as to what the newest thing is.
100%, and then of course parents understandably ask things like, should I spy on my child, look at their browsing history, see if I can figure out their passwords, look at their apps? What kinds of answers do you have for these kinds of questions?
I think everybody has a different philosophy for that. I think my main philosophy is to have a discussion with your child about it and about what you're going to do in terms of putting on parental controls. I don't think that's a bad idea, to put, age-appropriate parental controls on devices. What you and I know, working in the sexual addiction field, is that if there is a will, there is a way. I can block access 10 ways to Sunday, and someone's still going to find a way to look at pornography if that's what they really want to do. So it becomes sort of a privacy issue. There's apps and there's software that can keylog, and you can know every single thing that your child writes. You can, have software that screenshots it. I'm not as big a fan as those types of things because I think it's helpful for teens to sort of learn some autonomy, some digital autonomy, which is where I'm more of a fan of discussions with them or, setting up a transparency model that I'm not going to, put any spy software on there, but if at any time I ask to see your phone, you're going to hand it over to me and I have, the ability to look at it, sort of a transparency model. There's another program that I really like called Pocket Guardian, and what that does is sets up alerts for a parent if their child, like if keywords come up, so it does not invade the privacy of the child in that you're not reading the texts, you're not viewing the images in so much in spying, but it's saying, hey, something's going on this phone that you might want to talk to your kid about and see what's going on. So there's lots of
once again, that is called what?
Pocket Guardian. It's a neat little story. It's a company that was developed by two dads over here in Maryland, in the East Coast. They're a neat couple of guys just trying to figure out how to navigate the world of protecting their children while not invading their privacy and giving them some ability to build autonomy. There's a researcher, and her name is eluding me, who's at Penn State, who does a lot of research on this in terms of, what should we do, about monitoring kids versus not monitoring them, how swiftly, and her work really shows that if you don't over-monitor, the kids are building some resiliency. Maybe they're making some mistakes, but they're learning from them. So I'm more of a fan of transparency, less monitoring, but, maybe some of these apps or programs that red flag things that are going on versus the complete sort of spying and seeing everything your child's doing online. That's my personal preference. You're going to talk to another clinician, and maybe they'll have a difference of opinion.
Oh, and I get that, but certainly one of the things that I hear very loud and clearly is you want that transparency and you want that communication. And if a parent goes behind the child's back and views something, witness something, spies on that child is going to do everything possible to keep further information from his or her parent. And
Absolutely.
that just doesn't work long term. I certainly get a lot of parents that come in and they're just so saddened, they're so sick, they're so mortified because they've seen genital pictures of their children on the phone. And they don't know what to do because, of course, it absolutely triggers, oh, my gosh, my child is part of a pornographic situation. And so I really work with the parent not to be hypervigilant, but to educate them that, yes, this thing's going on, and now we just have to work with your child to talk about what your values are and what are the pros and the cons, the consequences of this behavior.
Absolutely.
Because, you said something about our generation probably would have said slutty, whore, hoe, that kind of thing. And I don't find that kids are doing that these days. They don't mark somebody as easy. They mark them as being open digitally. And so I do think the connotation is very, very different today than it would have been 20 years ago if you would exchange pictures of your genitalia or exchange pictures of yourself being scantily clad. It's much more acceptable.
Yes.
Their kids are much more desensitized, and so it doesn't necessarily mean quite the same thing.
And I think there's a openness about sexuality in the younger generations than there was even in my generation. There's the concept of gender fluidity was something that, in my generation we didn't have a term. We didn't talk about that. These younger generations aren't sticking to or adhering to gay, straight, bi, male, female, and they're not necessarily adhering to this is what okay or acceptable, quote-unquote, normal sex is like. So that, I think, is also very difficult for parents to kind of wrap their brains around sometimes. And, again, that might depend on the age of the parent, but, this concept of they're not thinking that certain things are sexually taboo that maybe my generation, socially was taught is something is sexually taboo. So there is a huge change or shift in perception, which can, again, create communication issues with parents or parents that are judging some of these behaviors, coming across judgmental to their children, even if they don't mean to, which then we can move into that shame and secret, area if we're not careful.
Well, and the opposite is true, too, and I know we're talking with Dr. Jennifer weeks about her new book, The New Age of Sex Education, How to Talk to Your Teen About Cybersex and Pornography in the Digital Age. And what I started to say is, unfortunately, I'm also talking with a lot of kids who have seen information that their single parents have passed on to acquaintances and dates, where they're seeing things they never wanted to see of their mother or father. Lots of sexting and texting, and you know, because parents don't necessarily, they're not as savvy, they have no idea that what they send on their iPhone will come up on their family's iPad.
I was going to say, or the iCloud. I mean, I've had a number of people who...
Absolutely. And
everybody who was hooked to the cloud now had access to the pictures of genitalia that were just sent, and wow, does that create a bit of a crisis.
So it really does. And fortunately, if a parent is dating, that usually means that there's a mom and a dad involved that are not together, and oftentimes the child tells the other parent. And, you know, obviously, this is a tough situation for families across the board. And so sometimes when I'm working with parents, you know, they then share their secret that they've done a little bit of this too, and they feel very shamed by it and very pressured. And they don't want their kids to be in that same situation. So it can get muddier and muddier and muddier. So let me just ask a very simple question, and that would be, what would you tell a parent who, you know, finds their child is looking at not each other, just online pornography in general?
I think the first thing I say is don't freak out. You know, this is a stay calm moment. So many parents' first reaction is, oh, my God, panic, you know, and in that emotional reactivity to then go confront their child. So it's like, don't freak out. Take a minute. Take a breath. You know, think about what's going on and not to have any kind of discussion in that emotional reactivity is sort of my first statement there.
Okay, so first statement is don't overreact. Stay as calm and neutral as you possibly can. Then what?
Absolutely. I think, and I, again, come at this a little different way, is that before I even would talk to them about, you know, talking to their child about what they've seen is, you know, what is it bringing up for them? You know, what is their judgment and what is their reaction around that? Because whatever the parents' stuff is around pornography maybe is going to influence how they then talk to their child. You know, doing this work that even the subtlest change of tone of voice or little inflection or eye movement, you know, really can be something somebody's watching for and can, you know, shut them down or induce shame. So I want the parents to know, like, what's going on for me that I just found this? Am I horrified because, you know, I think pornography objectifies women? Am I upset because, you know, this really goes against my religious values? You know, any number of things. You know, how do we work on that and kind of contain that a little bit before we go talk to the child to get, you know, about what's going on with the pornography? And then
okay, so one is stay calm, and then two, you think about what does this mean for you, and you decide, why am I so upset, angry, scared, confused, and then what's next?
I think in terms of conversation, so my then suggestion would be to have a conversation with the child, and I don't mean a confrontation, I don't mean a lecture, I don't mean a talking to, but a conversation, and I go to the work of the gentleman who wrote the wonderful book called Crucial Conversations, where they say that you can't really have a conversation unless the space feels safe. So how do we set up a safe environment, you know, for the child that we're going to talk to? You know, mom and dad or mom and stepdad, whoever is going to be here in this conversation, how do we make this safe? And then sit down and say, hey, or some variation of, obviously, you know, I was on your computer, you know, I saw in the cookies that there was this pornography link, you know, I just wanted to come to you and see what's going on. You know, have you seen this? You know, how do you feel about it? You know, what's going on for you that you're looking at this? And to really just become and keep that environment safe and in what I call kind of information gathering mode. Gather your information because, we don't really know what's going on. Maybe it was an accidental exposure to the pornography, maybe, or the opposite end of that spectrum, maybe they really have a problem, but we have to gather our data first.
Okay, so gathering the data is really, really important. And I'm sure your book absolutely goes into detail as to what kinds of questions you can ask your kids to, again, elicit some sort of conversation where they don't feel accused, they don't feel like you are ridiculing them. You're really curious and inquiring and wanting them to open up to the best of their ability.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is also a space for a parent to show their own vulnerability and model their own emotions and, own that, hey, this is really uncomfortable for me to talk about with you, so I'm sure it's uncomfortable, for you, and to just really own the reality of what's going on and to model, emotion, the ability to talk about your emotions and be vulnerable. And, for a lot of parents that might not be an easy task. Maybe that's something they have to learn to work on. And, again, it's not always this magical conversation where it's received perfectly. I also don't think these are one-time conversations. These are conversations, that happen over and over and over and over again. Part of that, I think, decreases the stigma around talking about sex and sexuality, creates an openness, and it also kind of gets rid of any room for shame. We're just going to talk about it because this is what we do as a family. We talk about healthy sexuality and our feelings, so there's no shame around sex and there's no secrets in terms of, yep, I saw online pornography, at my friend Joey's house and I didn't know what to do and I thought I'd come home and tell you. Things like that.
Yeah, and that's kind of a lead into sexual health in general because we know that parents have typically had difficulty talking about what is sexual health and sexuality and how do you talk to your kids about it. And, of course, we still deal with that age-old issue of, well, if I talk to my kids about it, I feel like I'm giving them permission to be sexual, which is the farthest thing from the truth when a parent talks to a child about good sexual health. So what are some of the guidelines that you ask them to share with their children there?
Well, when I talk about sexual health, and I don't have all of the pieces right off the top of my head, but I really like the guidelines that the World Health Organization put together that looks at sexual health in terms of actual many different models. So we talk about sexual health in terms of consent, right, exploitation. So truly teaching as a measure of sexual health, consent. What is consent? What does consent look like? There's that great video that I'm sure you've seen, and I don't know the name of it to tell your listeners, but where it's a little animated video where they compare, consent to having a cup of tea. So there's beautiful things that we can use to talk about consent. For sexual health, we talk about exploitation. We also talk about things like actual health, STDs and learning about STD transmission and learning about how to be healthy in sexuality. Part of sexual health is also enjoyment and pleasure, which I think isn't talked about enough in terms of teaching healthy sexuality, is that, part of healthy sexuality is that it's a fun, pleasurable, consensual, mutual behavior in terms of general sexual health. And how does that then translate into your family? So is that influenced by your family's religious beliefs or your philosophies or, things like that? So you can take all of these things and use, consent to, discuss, consent with your child and then look at, have they seen pornography that was non-consensual? Discuss that. Look at concepts of exploitation and, look at, pornography or sexting and, how does exploitation relate to these types of media? There's so much that you can take from sexual health just to make, sex less taboo in the family, but also really relate it to cybersex issues as well as, human-human interaction.
Well, that totally makes sense. So you're really talking about some of the bigger issues around sexual health and just getting your child's opinion about that.
Right.
It takes, a lot of courage for a parent to talk about issues that they are not totally comfortable with. And so
Absolutely.
if you were going to recommend 2 books for parents to read on teenage sexuality in general, what would that be?
Well, I'm going to back it up, actually, outside of teenage. And
you're going to make it younger.
I'm going to make it younger because, what we know is your average age of first exposure to pornography is, 10, 11 years old. Again, not necessarily compulsive use, but just exposure. There's a great series of books called 30 Days of Sex Talks. And their age, they're split up by age, and they go down to very, very young children. And, and very young children, they're not talking about explicit, sexual content, but they're talking about things like consent and, objectification and all of these wonderful concepts that we're teaching before we're even talking about sex. So there's multiple volumes, and that's 30 Days of Sex Talks. So the youngest one is ages 3 to 7. And those are wonderful books, and they're put out by Educate and Empower Kids. And then, there's also some other great books out there, and I'm wondering, I'm sort of in my brain, I'm unprepared to answer this question fully.
I'd like to recommend that if you want to get a great newsletter that gives you the newest and most current articles, ask to subscribe to Porn Proof Kids, which is an amazing, I don't know if it's weekly or monthly. I want to say it's probably biweekly. A newsletter that comes out to keep parents abreast of what's out there, what's going on, and what to do. And I've had them on the show. I think, haven't you even done some articles for them, Dr. Jen?
No, I haven't, but I'm aware of their work, and they, I think they put out, I think that's the company that put out the illustrated book about pornography for younger kids.
Absolutely, yes, that's exactly right. They did.
Yeah.
So I would
There's
really
also,
highly recommend them. And, again, they're an amazing site. I stay current with it at all times. And literally all you have to do is Google Porn Proof Kids. They had another name, and they just didn't feel like that was grabbing the public, and so they switched their names. And, they talk about from ages 6 on up. So I knew the minute I said that you would back that up, because truly it does require that we talk to our kids at 6, 7, 8. My listening audience knows that when I was 5 and 6, my mother educated me about the proper private parts and how you had babies, and she just did it very simplistically. And so I knew and was educating my friends probably at 10, 12, 14. I became the sex educator in the school, and I always teasingly said, I cannot believe my mother didn't get a call from an angry parent or the principal saying, shut Carol down, please. I mean, she shouldn't be talking about this stuff. But what I found to be true was that because I had that kind of education and I was using proper terminology and explaining things very simplistically because that's how I knew it, kids wanted that information. They wanted to know. They were curious, but they didn't have the courage to ask their parents.
And their parents weren't thinking to educate them,
Exactly. So it's wonder that I got into this field, even though
it's
for
not
me it
surprising
felt
you
like
were
it
doing
was
this
default.
very young.
I think it was probably a destiny, and it sounds like it was a destiny for you too.
We ended up here. I want to just throw one more resource out there for parents, if I can.
Absolutely.
It's an organization called Family Online Safety Institute. And I can give you a website, www.fosi.org. And they actually have a whole section of their organization that is dedicated to what they call good digital parenting. So it's not just about sexuality issues, but also, screen time and gaming. But it's just a really great resource for digital parenting.
Okay, I appreciate that. And again, you said that's www.fosi.org. FOSI, as in Sam. So it's the Family Online Safety Institute. Got it. Family Online Safety Institute. And for anybody that, needs this information, you can always email me at carolthecoach@AOL.com, and I will send this to you. Now, Dr. Jennifer, before we end, how can people get a hold of you, and how can they get your book?
Sure. The company that I founded and run is called Sexual Addiction Treatment Services. Our website is www.sexualaddictiontreatmentservices.com. We're located in Pennsylvania. We have 2 offices here in Pennsylvania, and we are also always happy to talk to people if they're from out of state to try to get them resources where they live. So we're happy to be as helpful as we can. The book is currently on Amazon in ebook, and it is in pre-order for the hard copy. So if you go to Amazon.com and look up The New Age of Sex Education, we should be there. It's available on some other venues, Barnes & Noble and things like that, but in today's world, everybody tends to go to Amazon.
Absolutely, 100%. Well, Dr. Jennifer Weeks, thank you so much for sharing your information. I'll be really excited to look at your book, so I will go to Amazon, pre-order it, or just get the ebook. I'm not sure which one yet, but I will definitely do that because there just isn't a lot of good information out there, and this is, a very difficult conversation for so many parents with their children, and as a result, so many children with their parents. So I appreciate your help with this.
Oh, absolutely, and thank you so much for having me on. It's as my clients and people around me know, these are my soapboxes. I love to talk about these things. The less clients I have, the better it is for the world.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, you have a great week and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Carol, very much.
Uh-huh. So that was Dr. Jennifer Weeks. And again, she wrote the book, The New Age of Sex Education, How to Talk to Your Teen About Cybersex and Pornography in the Digital Age. And we are always bringing you the up-and-coming information, so keep us tuned in. I know most of you don't listen on Monday Night Live, but you do download and open up those downloads every week, so I so appreciate that. I want to say next week we got Thomas Gagliano on, and he has written a book about parenting too, but he's got something new and different. He wants to talk about sex addiction 101, and so we're going to be talking to him too. And that is next Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thanks for listening, and as I say at the end of every show, there will only be one of you at all times. I want you to fearlessly have the courage to be yourself. Remember what Dr. Jen said when talking to your child. It's so important that you stay emotionally neutral and not overreact no matter what you're worried about. You want to increase that communication. So you have a good week, and I'll talk to you next Monday night. More sex help with Carol the Coach.